Okay, we might begin, and I'm sure some people will join us as we go along. So I'm really pleased to invite you all and have you join us in this conversation today about workforce attraction and retention in the community services sector. My name's Anna Zilli. I'm the Chief People Officer here at Anglicare Southern Queensland. And to begin this session today, I'd like to acknowledge the First Peoples of the land on which we gather today. Here in Brisbane, it's the Turrbal and Yagara people, and I'd like to acknowledge their care and spiritual connection to country, to land, sky, water and sea. I'd like to pay our respects to their elders past and present, and to all First Nations people joining us today, and respectfully recognise that sovereignty has never been ceded. So again, thank you for joining us for this important conversation. And no doubt, as you all know, and the reason why you're attending here is our sector is essential. It spans aged care, disability support, youth and family services, and it's increasing and growing, particularly in aged care. But despite the growth, we continue as a sector to face some real challenges: workforce shortages, insecure funding, and historical undervaluing of care work. So to better understand what's driving people to join and stay in these roles, Anglicare has partnered with the Centre for Policy Futures at UQ, and together we've conducted a study involving interviews, focus groups and large-scale surveys across aged care and youth work. Alongside the research from UQ, Anglicare has also developed a Workforce Futures stimulus document. And this piece of work builds on the federal government's 2023 white paper on jobs and opportunities. It looks at the future of human services workforce and their demographics, economic, technological, environmental and social factors that shape the way we work, both across the community sector and here at Anglicare, and now into the future. So today is about sharing what we've learnt. But before we delve into the findings, I'd like to introduce you to our partners at UQ. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Professor Greg Marston. Greg, give us a bit of a wave there so we know who we're talking to. So Greg leads the UQ Centre for Policy Futures at the Queensland Decarbonisation Unit. His research explores poverty, climate justice and the future of work. He investigates how social policies and basic income models can support workforce transitions, especially in response to automation, climate change and economic restructuring. We're also joined by Dr. Robert Archidiacono. Robert, there you are. So Robert is a postdoctoral research fellow at UQ's Centre for Policy Futures. His work critiques digital agriculture and its impact on rural labour. With a focus on food sovereignty and social justice, he explores how technological change reshapes agricultural workforces and challenges sustainability in global food systems. And finally, but not lastly, Dr. Ariana Gata. So Ariana is a research fellow at UQ's School of Economic and Centre for Policy Futures. Her research focuses on labour market discrimination and workforce policy. Using experimental and quantitative methods, she examines how policy interventions affect employment outcomes for marginalised groups and help address workforce shortages and inequality. And shortly you'll be hearing from them to present the research findings. But just before we do, a little bit of housekeeping. If I could ask all participants to place their mic on mute. Please use the chat function for questions. We will have a few minutes at the end of the presentation where we'll go through those questions. So please feel free to use that as we go along. And just a reminder that this session is being recorded. I'm going to now hand over, I think I've done everything, to Ariana, or to Greg. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks very much, Anna, for the context and for the introduction. It's really good to be here and to share some of the findings of the research project that we partnered with Anglicare Southern Queensland on. And as Anna said, it's a larger context, obviously, that we're thinking about here in relation to community services. We focused in on a couple of roles, but I'm sure there are lots of similarities with other roles in the sector. And also some of the issues that we focused on in the research are also generic to other parts of the labour market, because really the heart of the study has been a focus on kind of workforce attraction and retention, and that's not just a challenge in the community services sector, of course, but there are some unique aspects to care work and providing care and receiving care that can add some additional challenges around workforce attraction and retention. So I think it's, before I delve into the findings in more detail, it's just important, I think, to acknowledge some of those, particularly where the emotional labour that can be involved and the challenging nature of the roles. And there's lots of documentation around these issues for community services work. And I think it's also important to say at the outset, therefore, that this is not just obviously a challenge that's unique to Anglicare, but neither is the responsibility for responding to these issues. These are sector-wide challenges, and it does require a kind of multi-level response, not just from the sector itself, obviously, but from governments who you provide the regulatory environment and the funding for lots of these services, as well as other agencies and, of course, other parts of the workforce. As I said at the beginning, what we're trying to really focus on here on, though, is what are the factors that might improve retention, particularly for a more diverse workforce. Some of the early conversations we had with Anna and Leanne were about these issues, in a sense, to try to address, which again is a very large challenge, but the highly feminised nature of care work and paid care roles in particular, but also unpaid care, that around 70% of that workforce is undertaken by women. And also that it's difficult to attract younger people to that work, and that a more diverse workforce is good for workers, but it's also good for clients. So that was part of the challenge. But coupled closely with that was thinking about the issues to do with retention. So it might be a goal, and that's a important goal, to have a more diverse workforce. But if you're not able to retain that workforce, then we're not also doing a very good job, because there's lots of time spent and in resources by organisations, obviously in recruitment, but there also needs to be the organisational supports in place, career pathways that people can see that have some direction, and also opportunities, as I said, for further training and professional development that would be factors that'll matter in terms of the retention piece. So we didn't want to lose that either in the focus. We also know that there's a fair bit, as I've already said, that's known about the nature and characteristics of the workforce, but what is within the scope of the organisation like Anglicare itself to think about its recruitment and marketing strategies, for example, or to think about what are the sorts of supports in place, taking into account the different context for where the work that Anglicare does happen. So the issues for obviously residential care are very different to doing outreach work, for example. So we have to think about those different environments as well. And through the nature of the research, what we wanted to do was to provide some breadth and some depth in looking at those issues. We know that also that the role of technology and AI is going to play a big, not just in this sector, but it's a conversation we're having across Australia, but also globally, about what the impact of those technologies will be. Just, I think last week, the Productivity Commission released a draft report, for example, which had some recommendations around some clearer guardrails, thinking about safety and quality of work, the regulatory environment, and trying to get some consistency there. And there will be obviously lots of benefits from AI and automation, but there's also a fair bit of apprehension, I think it's fair to say, and some fear, not just in terms of the classic one that is often put up around technological unemployment, but what does it also mean for the nature of work? What sort of tasks are still the ones that should be done by people, and what other tasks might be done by AI and automation? And there, as I said, there are some good aspects to this, I think, coming for us in terms of it may enable people to stay living independently longer, particularly where we can have smart homes and so forth with sensors. But there's also lots of ways in which we have genuine concerns around the nature of AI and automation, particularly in human services, where it can increase the chance around bias, for example, and discrimination in some cases. So that's a really live issue. And we also know going forward that the population ageing, quality of the workforce, technology that I've already mentioned, are all factors that are going to need to be navigated successfully if we're going to have a workforce that's recognised and valued, and that is sustainable. And that was a really key focus of the research as well, thinking about that. It's also good timing to be talking about these issues this week. We know that down in Canberra, the Economic Reform Roundtable is getting underway. And again, leading into this roundtable, there's been some focus on the care workforce, perhaps not as much as we would have liked. And I think, as Anna alluded to, that's one of the things that we know, is that we know that care work is valuable, certainly by the people who receive it and people who provide it. And it's a very rewarding role to play in the community, but it perhaps hasn't been given the recognition in the broader economy that it should. And in that sense, I think there's still a lot of work to do. So this is an important part of work, and I think wider advocacy in the research. We've got some key findings and some directions and implications, which we'll talk to in a moment. But we also know that there's not much knowledge here on the Zoom, on the Teams call. So we're really keen to hear from others about how they navigate this, because there are unique challenges that are got to do with space and place. Obviously, in South East Queensland is different to what it means to provide these services in remote and regional areas, as well as different states who may have some different challenges. So really keen to see what's similar and different. And as Anna said, we really do want this to be interactive in the sense that we'll give some of the key findings. In a moment, I'll hand over to Rob and Ariana to go through those, but to leave plenty of time for discussion. And I don't know whether we're going to talk about what happens next with the report and so on, but we are, very soon able to release the and get the report out as well, so that it'll be able to be used. So I did all of that without that slide that was meant to be in front of me, so I'm not driving the slideshow. Is that okay, Rob? You're driving that? Good.
Yes, I'm happy to start driving now if you'd like. All
right, thanks very much. Thanks, Rob. I'll hand over to you and Ariana.
Thanks, Greg, and thank you, Anna, also for that that very warm introduction. I'm just going to quickly get the slides up so we can talk to some of these findings. Okay, so just to give a bit of context on how we went about doing this research, it was a mixed method study where you used both qualitative and quantitative approaches. From a qualitative perspective, we did focus groups and semi-structured interviews. We had 60 members of the public across 10 different focus groups. These were mixed gender, mixed age, to get a sort of broad sort of subsector of how people understood the community care sector. And this was broadly focusing at their perceptions and understandings. And we'll talk about that in a moment. These perceptions and understandings then informed some of the quantitative work I'll talk about in a moment also. In addition, and this particularly more spoke to the retention dimension, we wanted to do a series of semi-structured interviews with current staff. So we ended up having a series of people working in aged care, disability work, youth work, both in-home, out-of-home, community context. And this, gave us some of those sort of broad brushstrokes as to how people in the sector are seeing some of those retention challenges. This was supported by this large body of quantitative work. We developed this discrete choice survey experiment in a co-design workshop with ASQ back in January. The discrete choice survey experiment went out to 2,900 people. The survey consisted of 2 different job examples, 2 different job posts side by side with a series of different attributes around contract type, understanding the flexibility, around organizational supports. And people went through each of these contracts, each of these job posts, and decided on either job post A or job post B. So at the end, we'd had, I think people did 10 of these each. So we had sort of some 30,000 data points that we can compare across different attributes, which then allowed us to generate some of these findings. So the way we've developed the findings was, and the way we're going to present this today, is across these 9 core sort of criteria. And within each of them, we're going to talk to some of the sort of general implications that we've kind of garnered from these findings. And then Greg will talk a bit at the end about how this can kind of be understood in terms of broader recommendations at a sectoral level and also at an organizational level. So without further ado, I'm going to do a couple of these findings, then Ariana will jump in and support with some of the others. Firstly, with regards to the perceptions of the sector, just before I start that, it's worth noting on the right-hand side here, we've tried to also bring in the voices of those people from the focus group discussions, the FGDs, and from the semi-structure interviews. So for us, it was really important to have those voices come through in the research as well. I won't talk to those, but I'll let you sort of read through them in your own time. So yeah, there was some certainly positive perceptions and the motivations of people wanting to work in this space. From an intrinsic level, so this is more the sort of work itself, making a difference or doing meaningful work. These were the most noted dimensions as to why people might want to work in the community care sector. Providing support to vulnerable groups was something that women generally highlighted more than men. Building relationships with elderly people was something that young males highlighted quite regularly. And then mentoring people and being role models was something that generally young people sort of identified as well. On an extrinsic level, and this is more how the work is done and where the work is done, flexibility of work hours and being part of a growing and secure industry were seen as positive motivators for people coming into this space, and particularly that growing and being part of a growing secure industry, more so by men than women. And we'll see a little bit later that a lot of this maybe falls down to sort of those societal gendered dimensions of men being breadwinners and wanting to be in secure work. It was also perceived by young people that the sector is a job that pays well. So broadly looking at what this means, I think for us, the implications here are, given that there's different demographics of society who see or are attracted to the community care sector in different ways, it's around developing marketing campaigns that can really target those demographics and highlight those extrinsic rewards that come out of frontline work. To contrast the motivations, there is also a series of barriers or challenges that people identified around working in this space. The one that came up the most, particularly through focus groups, but also in the semi-structured interviews, was the emotional burden of the job. So I think that the quote on the right-hand side sort of articulates this, that you in the work, you are surrounded by the realities of people passing away. In youth work, it was often highlighted that dealing with young people who've gone through trauma also has an emotional burden on the carers as well. In the aged care setting, the physical dimension of the work, lifting, carrying was something that was highlighted. And then for youth work, particularly for females, the threats to physical safety was something that was also noted. The nature of the tasks involved was also something that came up pretty regularly. This had to do with, for instance, hygiening or cleaning or toileting in aged care, where some people sort of noted that no matter how much they were paid, this was not something they could see themselves doing. It was sort of a barrier for them entering this space. Extrinsically, the social status and image of the sector was something that was seen as a barrier. This came up particularly with reference to the Aged Care Royal Commission. And then, interestingly, in contrast to the previous slide where it was a motivator, it was also perceived as a low-paid job. So I think the people's perceptions and understandings of the sector is quite diverse. Finally, entry requirements were not necessarily known by people wanting to enter the space. They didn't know what qualifications were required, and there was a perceived limited career progression opportunities. So I think for us, the broad takeaways here were around public initiatives that promote and increase the education around the value of care work to challenge some of these negative perceptions. Overall, these barriers and motivators were used to scaffold how we went about the survey choice experiment. So particularly some of the things around the emotional burden of the job, for instance, we've looked at how organisational supports might be able to mitigate some of this. So I'll pass over to Ariana to go through some of these details, and then I will wrap up a little bit at the end.
Thank you, Rob. Indeed, the experiment also touched upon a number of other dimensions more in detail, one of them being contract type and leave arrangements. So which one of these is most effective in increasing attraction in the sector? Well, people were much more likely to choose jobs in the sector that offer permanent full-time work. This is a core takeaway from this exercise that we've conducted. And this was particularly true for younger cohorts and men with dependents. And this speaks to what Rob was mentioning before, to the fact that it reflects the gender norms possibly around being the main breadwinner for men, particularly. At the same time, though, so while permanent full-time work was the preferred arrangement, contractually speaking, we also find that casual contracts can be improved by offering prorated leave, so the option of accumulating leave for people on casual contracts. So this type of contracts, so casual contracts with prorated leave, were preferred to the standard casual arrangements, and this is particularly so for younger cohorts aged 18-25. We also find that permanent part-time is preferred to standard casual arrangements, particularly by women and those with dependents. Hence, they are a good option, but also there needs to be attention to potentially attracting even more women. So the workforce diversification aspect. So the main takeaway from this is, where possible, and we know that the funding arrangements here are important, where possible, offer full-time employment and target casual and permanent part-time to different demographics. And also we want to stress that indeed full-time employment is possibly the best way to attract men, at least based on the results of this part. Rob, if you can go to the next slide. Thanks. So the next dimension that we focused on was flexibility. So can flexibility support attraction and retention? This is the key question here. And well, from the qualitative side, so the qualitative evidence shows us that people value flexibility as a tool to balance personal and caregiving responsibilities in general. And importantly, in the sector, so it was seen as an important mean to mitigate the emotional demands of the job. So people would indicate that they would use flexibility would be important to them to be able to recover from moments where the emotional demands are high, which are frequent in this sector. At the same time, while respondents were stressing the importance of flexibility to themselves, they also acknowledged that this might not be possible in certain instances, particularly in the aged care. So that, so people could see a tension between providing quality care, especially for people that have complex care needs. And some were skeptical that it's even possible to marry these two things. Relatedly to this, indeed, we know that there have been organizations that have started offering gig work style flexibility. So, for example, thinking of Mabel and platform work that are changing disrupting essentially the sector. So, and we thought, what if these kind of arrangements were available in traditional organizations? And therefore, in the experiment, we actually offered jobs, fictitious jobs that offered this option. And we found that compared to other flexibility arrangements, it was indeed the most attractive, but it tended to attract more women. Hence, this again means that while the scope for innovating in the flexibility space, it comes with the risk of, again, attracting even more women to the sector. And at the same time, there's skepticism essentially around whether it's actually a viable strategy to implement flexibility in this context. And the advice here is, indeed, the implication is for the sector to be probably a follower rather than a leader. So first observe and then act and adapt to your particular sector. Next slide, Rob. Can you still hear me? Yeah, it's good. Sorry. The next element that we focused on, as Rob has beautifully also introduced before, is organizational support. So people know that this is an emotionally demanding job, both youth work and aged care. And indeed, they want to see trauma support, counseling, psychology sessions, the employee assistance program, all of these things are valued. At the same time, also alternative ways of providing support would be have been advanced. For example, the availability of some more senior staff that can, in essence, provide confidential advice when things become difficult, especially when the emotional intensity of the job becomes very high. Also, peer learning systems could be a way to provide more support to staff, meaning having, for example, two people take care of the same client and hence can also share the emotional side of things. So in short, for retention, it's very important to have all of these support systems in place, and some new ones have been identified. At the same time, though, we found that when some, let's say, original, say, supervision and mentorship, peer learning systems, these systems, when they are advertising job ads, actually they paradoxically deter potential applicants because they signal job stress in a way. So this highlights the importance of having these systems in place, but then being careful when they are framed in job ads for attraction, to indeed promote attraction. And yeah, another aspect indeed very important for the way the sector is perceived is the presence or the perception of the absence, actually, of opportunities for development. So yeah, there is a widespread belief that the sector promotes jobs that do not provide pathways for career development, and this calls for indeed investment in training, but also from the beginning showing people where they can go with this when they start a career in the sector. We've also in this case, we've tried to see if different ways to promote opportunities for development in job advertisements would make a difference. But what we didn't find much of an effect, and this suggests that people, especially outside of the sector, place more value on more concrete attributes, probably things that they can tangibly recognize, like contract type, flexibility, wage, and also probably the reputation of the sector in this respect is compromised, and hence there needs to be some more change, such that there is less of a barrier. And finally, at least for this particular part, one recurrent theme that came across from the quality interviews as well is that given the demands of these jobs and actually the level of skill that they require, still people felt that the financial compensation was inadequate. At the same time, though, we want to stress that employment security was actually more important than increased hourly wages for attraction. So permanent full-time work was actually more effective than offering 10, 20% salary increases. We've also done a bit of an exercise here where we've tried to estimate what we call willingness to pay, which is the monetary value that is attached to different job attributes. And indeed, in line with what I mentioned before, there's a large willingness to pay for permanent full-time work, some willingness to pay for gig work style flexibility. And interestingly, when we offer the supports, people need to actually be compensated to take on jobs that require these extra supports, which is in line with the fact that people feel that the compensation should be higher given the demands, in essence. Finally, we've tried to estimate what would be a salary that would attract a broad section of the workforce, and we've found this sweet spot between $47 and $56 an hour. So at the moment, the current wage does attract people, but only from sectors that have lower wages. And yeah, so this would be a spot that maximizes attraction. And with this, I leave it back to Rob, which will talk to you about qualifications and entry requirements.
Thanks, Arianna. Looking first at qualifications, I think if we look at the bottom bar on each of these graphs, the top one being for youth work and the bottom one being for aged care work, 35 and 42% of people were not interested in becoming qualified, having a Cert 4 in order to do this work. So, well, that's almost a bit over a third in both instances. I think if we look at the next two up, yes, I'd be interested in getting the qualification, only if I don't have to pay for it. And yes, I'm happy to pay for it, but only if there's a guaranteed long-term job. Both of these combined indicate that while qualifications are a barrier, guaranteed full-time employment or supporting people to get that qualification increases substantially how people might be attracted to the sector. To then move a little bit more sideways towards career entry, an acknowledgement of the diverse pathways to get into the sector, recognising lived experience and transferable skills. The lived experience, transferable skills from education, nursing, hospitality, range of other sectors. These are opportunities to sort of leverage these existing expertise and find ways for these people to enter into the sector with or without that qualification, or having conversation on what that qualification is. And then also personal experience. So particularly when talking about youth work, it came up quite regularly in the semi-structured interviews, talking to people already in the space. And this quote on the right-hand side speaks to this also. Those people young people who may have come through homelessness or their own sort of challenging situations, they can empathise, they can understand, they can engage and establish rapport better with youth than maybe people who don't have that lived experience. So how can the sector look at really recognising that lived experience as an entry point for people to come into this space also? Proactive outreach was also a way to address some of the limited understanding of these roles. I think we noted that it came up a few times that nursing or the police force often do outreach into educational settings as a way to increase awareness. So maybe there's also scope here for the community care sector to do something similar. And also outside of specific sectoral, but more those individuals or groups of people who share those common values and experiences with the community care sector, how can we specifically target them to recognise those, and again, leverage on those motivations for people wanting to work in this space? As part of the survey choice experiment, where we asked people if they would prefer job A or job B, we also then said, if you were to prefer one over the other, would you then preference this over your current role? We then had a bit of an idea as to what industries people currently work in. And in this instance, we can look at this, what we call transition probability. So we know that from agricultural, forestry and fishing, accommodation, food services, retail trade, manufacturing, wholesale trade, across both youth work and aged care, people who came from those sectors were more likely to prefer one of the roles we posted in the discrete survey choice experiment. So this sort of implies that there is an opportunity to strategically target recruitment towards these sectors. And then inversely, mining, public administration, professional, scientific and technical services, probably not worth putting the energy into those because there's less of a likelihood to actually attract people with those backgrounds or coming from those sectors. As Greg articulated at the start, attracting people to the sector is only useful if they're then going to remain in those roles. So a big part of the semi-structured interviews we did was looking at what does retention look like. And there was a few key themes that came out of this. First is supportive leadership, management and culture. We had a couple of instances where facilities managers had come from maybe hotel management or something of the sort, where there was lack of maybe understanding, empathy of the realities of what frontline work looked like. So leaders who can really empathise with frontline staff was something that's seen as really important to retain existing staff. As Arianna mentioned a moment ago, career progression was important also within the retention piece, not just an attraction. So we talked a bit earlier about seniority. So more senior staff being mentors actually recognise this as career pathways for ways to leverage those increasing knowledge and skills of people already in the sector. Some other broader sort of structural challenges. I'm not saying anything new when we talk about understaffing to anyone in this room, but the understaffing obviously then impacts the workload, the stress levels, the burnout. There was a couple of instances where frontline staff were not taking time off because they knew it would put more of a burden on their colleagues. And I think that's just, while it really shows the testament to the values they hold, it's not sustainable for organisations to keep having this. So broadly, how does the sector address some of the challenges with understaffing? The gender nature of the workforce, as Arianna said, some of the dimensions around gig style work and others were more favoured towards females in an already gendered workforce. Males play an important role in this space, whether it is around being role models, whether it's around gender preferences of clients, of the people who are caring for them. So how can we really push back on some of the gendered nature of the work? And finally, this sort of contestation between large organisations and their ability to connect with local communities. This came out a bit with regards to, I think, from the Aged Care Royal Commission, this push towards professionalisation. And I know that was for aged care, but also in youth work, there was this sentiment that young people will be less inclined to establish rapport and be able to engage with someone who comes in with sort of very professional mindset. That might maybe not be the entry point for them to start that work together. So I might leave it there, and Greg's going to talk a little bit more about sort of broadly what these overall means for the recommendations for the sector, both at a sectoral level and organisational level. But this is a very quick overview of a lot of the work that we did, and hopefully in the future, when this report comes out, you can see in a bit more detail some of the findings we've already shared here. So, Greg, over to you.
Thanks, Rob, and Arianna for going through the findings, the qualitative and the quantitative. Again, as Rob said, there's probably not lots there that is intuitive and that was probably already known, although I think the surprise for me was that, might be targeting forestry workers as changes into the industry is one that I wouldn't have anticipated, and looking at people who might want to move into doing care work. But also I think that in some ways speaks broadly to the other challenge that we're facing around the energy transition and what aspects of industry and workforce are in decline in some of those areas, and where the opportunities are, because clearly the service economy is large and will continue to grow, and an important part of that is obviously frontline social services work. Really, this is just before we hand over for discussion and questions, but to pull a few of the threads together at different levels, because as we said in the beginning, we recognise that this is a systemic issue. It's not anyone's organisational responsibility to address what we've talked about, but it is important, I think, to think about that, therefore, through a kind of systems lens, to think that this is a complex challenge, that anything that you do in one part of the ecosystem will affect the other. But also, I think system thinking encourages us to be experimental in terms of workforce models, employment models, and I know that Anglicare is one organisation that's got an appetite to do that, as are many other organisations experimenting with flexibility and hybrid nature of the workforce, for example, is something that's really been a big shift since the pandemic. And obviously you come up against limits to flexibility by the nature of the job, and also balancing the principles of flexibility for workers against continuity of care for clients, for example, because it might be one thing that suits workers in terms of that gig style flexibility, but it's very much another if the client obviously wants to establish rapport and a relationship and not have 8 different care workers in their life. So I think that that's something that will obviously have to be balanced here, and that's I think the importance of systems thinking. And on the experimental side, it's important, I think, to try some of these different models out, but also to get the feedback loops in relation to what worked and what didn't work, but also to hear and learn from other organisations doing this work. And so, as I said, this is really very much part of a coalition, I think, approach, and thinking about the organisations and how they might be prepared to make some changes, but also, as I said, to learn is really important in a system that's functioning well. Really at the heart of this Venn diagram is obviously the individual themselves, the individual worker. And there's a whole lot of characteristics there that we haven't spoken about as much, but to do with their demographics, in terms of age, their own personal situation, what levels of support they've got. But sitting around that person obviously is the organisational context, both at the frontline sense and their sense of purpose, the sense in which they can feel that they're part of the team, the sense in which they've got a working relationship. And as Rob and Ariana alluded to, that where they see support, how difficult that might be in an environment where people are doing work where they're the ones going to individuals' homes to offer that support. There's not much of an opportunity all the time to interact with your peers. So how do you address that versus residential work, which is a much more team-based approach? Through to kind of structures and systems. And as I said, there's lots of operational requirements, and those regulations are changing rapidly for the sector. And that's something that obviously will continue to unfold during the course of this year and next year. So that's not something that's going to stop. Is the nature of change in terms of the regulatory environment, the attention being paid to conditions and workforce requirements as well, given staff-client ratios in light of the various inquiries. So there's a lot for organisations to be responsive to. And again, that's going to be part of the constant environment, I think, in this system, that at least it's given it the attention it deserves, but it's also very challenging for organisations, obviously, to get up to speed and to get ahead of that change. And then at the system-wide level, I think the issue we haven't touched on as much, which is about a much longer term objective, but how do you shift those public perceptions and some of the negative perceptions that the media give around the nature of the work when there is a scandal or where there is a tragedy, for example, as well as the limited kind of perception that people have around that this work can be something that people might able to change roles in, whereas there is this dominant public perception, as Ariana and Rob alluded to, around this being a sort of cul-de-sac job or a dead-end job that people won't be able to move up and through. And Anglicare themselves have obviously got lots of examples where people have moved both vertically within the organisation once they've done frontline roles, but also horizontally into other areas of work in the organisation. So it's important to highlight those success stories, I think, as well, in terms of onboarding. So that's really key. So the little circles that are around the organisation, I think, is where we've tried to focus much of our attention in the directions and implications, but always keeping it in a much wider sort of socio-cultural context, even as broad as the whole nature of care and the value we place on care, as I said at the beginning. That I think requires, that's an attitudinal change, it's a structural change, but it's also increasingly becoming important in terms of the sort of work and the wider recognition of both unpaid and paid care work roles. There are thinkers, for example, that talk about the importance of a universal care model in thinking about that, care is a responsibility for men and for women, and it has its own life cycle approach, but we all should be involved in both social reproduction, but also productive activities, and to have a much more gender neutral lens on that will be important, but as we'll be addressing the kind of gender wage gap that Ariana alluded to, and that in itself will create the conditions for a more diverse workforce. So that's the distant horizon, I suppose, in terms of where you'd want to go. And it's important, I think, to keep that focus in mind. But there are lots of things that are still within the remit and the agency of organisations to be able to influence. So that's where I said we put most of our attention on those factors. So that's for a little bit where we're going. And as I said, we'll have this in a form that you can read in more detail on the short term and medium term and longer term implications that we've spoken about. But really keen to hear from you. So I might hand back to you, Anna. Thanks for your attention, everyone.
Thanks, Greg, and thank you, Ariana and Rob, for presenting the data for us. And I will reiterate that we will be sending the full report to everyone who's participated today, and we'll also upload that onto LinkedIn and our project's website at both Anglicare and UQ. So we will give you that full report. But if I just open the floor, I guess, to some questions, and I guess firstly, just wanting to hear from people about their reflections on the findings and some of those high-level recommendations. So open it up to the floor. Any surprises, any questions, anything you want to dig a little bit deeper in or understand a bit more? You can either pop up your hand or just come off mute and call out. Jessie.
I'll start.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm very interested in the statistic around what industries had the highest levels of retention, and I was wondering if someone could expand on that just a little bit about how that was reviewed, and was there any factors that might bias that reflection? So, for example, there's just not as many people that go into the industry, and so as a sample, it might be reflective that the retention rates are lower. I'm just wanted to understand that a little bit because I'm actually from the construction, transport, and logistics industry, so I thought that one was really interesting. And if you've got any more insights, I'd be keen to hear it.
That slide, Jessie?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. So I think it's just worth sort of acknowledging here that this is sort of one of the supplementary findings we were able to garner because we asked everyone who did the survey, the 2,900 people, what sectors they were currently sitting in. So I can't actually tell you what percentage came from each of these roles. I think what we can say is that this was also comparing with the current role they were doing. So we don't know what level they were at within that sector. We don't know what their existing flexibility arrangement were within that sector. This was just sort of a broad brush stroke to say, generally, this is where someone's coming from, and this is how they're sort of attracted to different roles. I might throw to Arianna because I think she's actually a bit more over this data than I am. Anything you want to add there to complement that, Arianna?
Yes, I think my understanding is that Jess interprets this as retention rates in their respective industries, but these are actually
in their industries, or the attraction or the retention in.
So this is essentially the way it is to be interpreted is roughly the percentage of people that come from this sector that chose a job in aged care or in youth work compared to their job. And this simply doesn't tell you anything about whether retention is high or low in these sectors. It could be low indeed, but they have a high propensity. If you offer them a job in aged care, for example, they'd have a high propensity to take it compared to transition essentially to aged care. It could be that this is because in these sectors, maybe there is a lot of turnover, right? So they'd be likely to transition to a lot of different things, actually. Yes, so that is the way this is to be interpreted.
Yeah, great. So it doesn't necessarily reflect the retention. It's about the attraction.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is the people that when we show them this, say, a job in aged care, and they selected yes, and I do it above my job. So I would be willing to transition from my job to this one you've just shown. So
if I could just add something on that, I think that speaking sociologically, I think there's something around identity that people have in terms of their jobs, as anyone would know. So even though hypothetically someone might entertain the idea of moving from one industry to another, there's a lot to do about the fact that who they see themselves as. And I think Jennifer Rayner did this study for mining communities, for example, where if you take someone who's been working in those communities as a male worker, driving trucks, then to say that mine's going to close and now the only jobs in town are going to be in the social services sector. She has said, that there's a lot of resistance to taking on that role. That's not to do with more about how you see yourself in terms of where you're going to work. And so there's, again, that might be about a misperception in terms of what the sector does and who it's for and so on. But that issue of identity, I think, still matters in terms of people's decision making, obviously, in terms of jobs. And again, there's misperception that needs to be tackled there if we're going to make this transition a little easier from one industry to another. But I think it is a barrier, even though people entertain the idea in the survey.
Is it worthwhile looking down the track, looking at the attributes of those particular industries to determine what is it about those industries that attract and retain? Because I think they, especially around the construction, transport industry and heavy lift, they do have a high retention rate in those industries. They do a fair bit of work around culture, and they're high reliability organisations. Yeah, it'd be interesting, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, in terms of looking at the retention factors in other sectors, competitive pay and conditions, mobility, for example, are really obviously fairly generic in terms of the retention in literature. Yeah. Sorry, Rob, you're going to jump in there.
Yeah, just worth noting here as well, when we went to, and this is sort of a relevant but a little bit aside, when we were doing the focus groups, we were asking the public what were their perceptions around flexibility, what did they perceive and understand, what was different ways they could have flexibility in a job. And we used FIFO, the fly in fly out examples from the mining sector, as a way to say, well, look, this works in other sectors as a way to maintain staff, to retain staff, to provide those different conditions for different individuals. And it wasn't something like FIFO, for instance, was something that wasn't really seen as relevant within the community sector space. So again, it's not quite with regards to attracting from one sector to the other, but I guess it probably speaks a bit to that identity comment that Greg's just made in terms of how people perceive and understand what a role in the community sector might look like compared to how they perceive and understand the realities of roles in some of these other sectors there as well.
Yeah, very interesting.
Great. Yeah, go on, Jess. Did you have another one?
Yeah.
Go on.
I do like to.
Go on.
What about so there's a big shift away from with it was a podcast I was listening to on the Governance Institute website, and it was around there's a shift away from traditional corridor careers and a transition into a lot of these new type of I guess you could have technical base, but there's a specific skill set that is going to be largely sought after, and something like 25,000 jobs in the US, and I figure might be not exactly correct, but in every 3 or 4 years, 25,000 roles disappear, and an equal number, if not more, of new positions are developed. So I guess essentially there's a big change, and it leads into your comment and information about uncertainty around AI and automation. And so one of the biggest issues or things that we're going to have is that create that culture of learning and adaptability. And I just wondered if you touched on that in any way within your survey and within your research. Do you have any comments, if that makes sense?
I just quickly, I mean, yes, the comment absolutely makes sense. We didn't touch on it in the survey explicitly. We do write about that broader technological and AI, what it means in parts of the report in the front end and the back end, but certainly in the document that Anna looked at, the ways in which it will impact on automation, and human services, I think will be fairly profound. And whether that frees up people to do the more complex, human-focused front work, I think in terms of and the AI allows, you know, the more routine tasks to be done, I think is the question. I think that probably in human service context that it will be a case of augmentation rather than replacement, at least for the foreseeable future. But at the same time, how humans adapt and adopt new technologies, you know, is evolving, but it also varies by demographics. We know that younger people are more comfortable having health consultations, to telehealth or with AI assisted, whereas older patients still prefer to see a GP in a traditional face-to-face appointment, and I imagine that in the care work, that again that'll vary again depending on the client base, for example. So I think it's going to be fairly uneven, and I think there's still going to be a lot of inertia and legacy technologies as well. That will mean that the kind of forecasts that come out to say that 50% of jobs is going to disappear in the next 10 years, as Bill Gates did that a few weeks ago, I think they're kind of alarmist. They're alarmist, right? But they do serve a sort of rhetorical purpose, I think, to put governments on notice that they do need to take this seriously. We do need to think about economic security. We need to think about what is that humans are still going to be good at. And I think that, you know, we have thought about this sector as one of the ones that's more immune to those new digital technologies, but I think that no sector's going to escape it. It's just that there won't be, I don't think, perhaps as automated as some other industries, for sure.
Yeah, I actually have my notes here from what I was referring to the other day, just then. And so it was around the organisation of resilience, and so skills, knowledge and capability, and for an agile workforce moving into the future, those attributes with the use of AI, your learning agility and emotional intelligence. So 70% of job profiles will be based on human capabilities and what human aspects are transferable in terms of technical aspects. So that a key piece of teaching people to be agile and move forward. It'd be interesting if other industries are going to start doing that. Is that going to be an opportunity for us if that skill starts to emerge as a transferable skill? Anyway.
It's a good question. Yeah. I think that for me, just generally, the issue around the agility needs to be underwritten with the sort of baseline of economic security, because you saw in the survey and the focus group that there's still a strong preference for full-time work. Again, that's not surprising because people want predictability of income in the context of a cost of living crisis. That's also becomes more acute. So that if you give people a sense of security, then they might be more prepared to take on risks and take more training and other opportunities that might present them to them, as long as they feel that if that fails, they don't go back to, you know, living a very precarious kind of workforce or being a precarious worker. And that's not just an agency like Anglicare's responsibility or any other social service provider. I think that's turns to the state ultimately to say, well, should we be looking at the state in terms of what their role is in being a kind of, you know, not last resort, but kind of first resort in thinking about providing that baseline. But increasingly, the income support system's gotten more conditional and more obligation generating. So that isn't the place in which people are feeling particularly secure. Housing doesn't give them a lot of economic security either in the context of the housing crisis. So it's a really acute question, I think, for ourselves as individuals to know where we think we might have that security in order to feel like we can experiment and to be agile, I think.
Great conversation. Thank you, Jess, for sparking some interest there. Any other questions on the floor in terms of the reflections of the findings? Does it resonate? Is there anything that surprised you that you would have expected to see that you didn't see? No questions?
I thought it was good.
Thank you, Jess.
I have a question, Hannah.
Sure, go Sue.
There was a slide talking about permanent full-time work being the most preferred. Is that the case overall, or is that the case for men, and that the permanent part-time and casual was more attractive to females? Can you just remind me?
So, in short, permanent full-time is most preferred option from literally everyone. So
okay.
It doesn't show the split by men and women and dependents, but it's men have even a stronger preference, but even women prefer it actually. So everyone prefers it. Maybe the only case in which this shrinks a bit is for people 55 to 70. So this age, when we split it by age, this thing you see down here, the bottom corner. Yes, so the yellow dot is people 55, 70, which supposedly are becoming less attached to the labor market. And I think what Greg's mentioned before is also very telling of this. I mean, cost of living crisis mean that people want stability, certainty. But yeah, were you surprised?
I'm a bit surprised. I think that research I've done, it might be the difference between the attraction and then the actual experience in those roles. So what you think it's going to be and what it ends up being it might explain my thought on this. Yeah.
Okay.
That's it. Nothing else to contribute. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue. Any, okay, let's pose another question maybe to the group. So what potentially are going to be if we address this or some of these findings in a kind of a wider sector systemic challenges, what are going to be the barriers or opportunities for us as a sector? Any thoughts on that one?
Anna, in the research you talked to the personal care work and giving showers and toileting being less attractive to potential workers, and then you add in the gender preferences as well, both from what gender of worker the client would like, but also how men and women might prefer to perform those roles. I see that as incredibly challenging. We're trying to attract men into the sector and they're instinctively not attracted to that kind of work. And we've got a bit of a hurdle on our hands.
This is a little bit of a kind of bringing together the comments from Jesse and also yours here now. So the one thing that came up a few times in the focus groups was the role of AI in kind of mixing and matching those different competing demands and opportunities. Where is there some staff who are prepared to do some sorts of roles, or some staff who want to work with some sorts of clients? How, from an organizational level, can you use digital tools to mix and match? It doesn't necessarily address the attraction piece you've just mentioned there, where that's a clear barrier, but maybe somewhere where those digital tools can help kind of fill those gaps a little bit in terms of scheduling and rostering on different people at different times. But yeah, we also don't have the answer on how we attract more men into that space. And I think this is where the type of contract or the conversation around flexibility or pay can help push the needle in a certain direction. But yeah, all we've got for that, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think, Sue, that it's a really important barrier that you've identified. Absolutely. Although sometimes people, they don't know what they don't know. So when they think of the role, that might be what they focus on because they see that as, a challenge and something they're not interested in doing. And yet, that might be 20% of what the day looks like and 80% looks like this, right? Or 10%. So maybe in the way in which we think about recruitment is, and again, it's going to be different messages for different demographics, but about the things that the men have said that they're attracted to in terms of the relationships and the rapport, some of the other aspects of the work. So it's not that you try to, bury that part of it in the recruitment strategy, but it's what and obviously you don't anyway in terms of the way in which you advertise for roles, but it's about just trying to, I guess, counter that message, knowing that is a barrier in the way in which ads are written and how interviews are, undertaken and the kind of intake and onboarding processes and so on, so that people realize that it's also that public perception that these jobs are much more than that and are rewarding in ways that they may not have thought about. Not insignificant or not diminishing it, but try and emphasize some of that as well, I think.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks, Sue. I think I've got a hand up. Verity. You're on mute there, Verity.
Sorry. this one about full-time work, I just personally think is a bit of a joke. You know, I work in, I'm Verity, I'm from Benetas, which is an Anglicare organisation in Victoria. It persistently comes up. Now I'm thinking about carers specifically. It's a heavy job. It's a very heavy job. Even with the, you know, lifting equipment, etc. People are frail, they're old. It's a very manual job. And to bit what you just said before about they think what they know and they don't really know, there is no way a carer can meet a full-time, as in 76 hours a fortnight physically. I think that's a work cover claim waiting to happen. You know, yes, I know people want full-time, but what I usually say to most of my managers is, you know, say 7 shifts a fortnight, it's like it would be getting up there well into the 60 hours a fortnight. And if they're physically capable, as in they're feeling okay during this fortnight and they want to pick up an extra shift, there is always extra shifts in aged care, always. Sick leave is a big problem, you know, et cetera, and it is an aging workforce as well. So, you know, I just think them wanting full-time work and their actual reality is then, and these are obviously people who aren't in the industry now, I get that too, because, you know, our experience is it just doesn't happen. They can't manage it. And even when they're on flexible, you know, pretty flexible part-time, the way they chop, change, drop this, pick up that, you know, managing the workforce is very, very challenging. I'm sure everyone who does it out there would be saying so. And I'm, you know, not trying to put down our workforce. They're valuable. We need them, and you know, they do an amazing job. But it's not all skewed to the employer, can I say? The employee in the aged care sector right now, if you ask me, has quite a lot of power and control. So it's interesting, you know, these people who aren't in the industry, what they think compared to what we are seeing as the reality. I definitely take on board the way we could look at how we pitch our campaigns in terms of recruitment and retention, etc. It'll be interesting. We're just about to do our staff engagement survey, so it'll be interesting to see what that gives us now for the people that we've already got in our workforce.
Verity, just from our engagement survey, I do know that women prefer part-time and casual, as you might imagine, as all the research says. And there's actually quite a big difference between the satisfaction once they start work. So what they think when they're coming into the sector, the attractiveness and what they're expecting might be very different in terms of how satisfied they are with different kinds of contracts.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
It is.
Yeah, I think that it's a good reality check, Verity. I think that the desire around the full-time work is more to do with the income than it is about the hours in that sense. And as I said, that predictability, but you can also, as Sue just mentioned, obviously get predictability when you've got permanent part-time roles because you know what the income is going to be, and you build your household budget on that basis. But I also think more generally in society, there's a kind of shift away from the full-time working week, you know, in the sense that post-COVID people are doing things differently. And I think full-time work's gotten a bit of a bad rap, and maybe for the right reasons in some ways. I mean, that's what the ACTU are taking to the Economic Reform Roundtable this week, is the whole push for the 4-day working week, where you get, you know, 100% of the pay and 80% of the hours, and you still get the same productivity, is the generalized claim that they're making based on some reasonably good experiments. But again, that's very challenging in aged care to do the equivalent, because the costs are so much higher, because of, in many cases, where you, not always, but if you've got the 24-hour care that needs to be provided, that's very costly for organisations to implement 4-day working weeks. It's different to kind of knowledge work that Rob, Ariana and I do at the university than it is in a care environment. But I think that, yeah, there's a broader debate going on, I think, around full-time work and its desirability, despite the fact people relying on the income associated with it. If they could get the same income for less hours, more people obviously would sign up.
Rob, did you have something? I saw your hand pop up and pop down. Was there something you wanted to add to that conversation?
No, Greg kind of touched on it already with regards to the 4-day work week. I think that was something that, in talking about flexibility, I mentioned before the FIFO, but in talking about flexibility in the focus groups, we also assessed people's perceptions of the 4-day work week, and that was certainly very favourable. But again, I guess talking to Verity's point there, if a 76-hour fortnight is already cumbersome, the idea of squeezing that into 2 4 days may be also equally challenging. So yeah, I guess this conversation I see also as part of the challenge. There's a perception for people coming into space, and then the reality is different, and how as organizations do those perception and reality maybe come a bit closer together, or what are the different ways that the reality can be supported to support that retention conversation. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Rob. Any further questions from the group? Ariana, were you going to say something?
I just wanted to add to this very interesting comment from
sure.
Verity, actually. So I have to say that most people in the survey, so 50%, maybe 60%, were working full time. So there's also a status element, I guess, associated with full-time work, which, yeah, indeed plays into this. The fact people are used to that, it gives the status and the stability that Greg also mentioned about. So if you were to pay them that salary, but they work whatever hours, they'd be happy too. In fact, I believe that probably the most preferred option would have been the gig work style with the full-time pay. But we all understand that there's limits to what is possible. Another thing that I think Rob hadn't covered from the focus groups is that indeed people complained about task variety. So you're absolutely right. They couldn't be doing that. So, I mean, for 40 hours, right? They would still put full-time work, but where they can do different things, not just lifting people all day long. Or so that was also a part of it. For example, being able to do administrative work. So I have breaks essentially to the intensity. That's absolutely part of it. So.
Interesting. Any other questions from the groups, comments, thoughts, challenges? No? All right. I think I would like to, on behalf of Anglicare, obviously thank our partners, UQ, Greg, Ariana and Rob for partnering with us and doing the research. Thank you all for joining us today to hear about the research findings. As I mentioned earlier, we will be sending out that full report to you all, and you'll also see it on LinkedIn and our Anglicare Southern Queensland and UQ website. So please feel free to share it with your networks and your colleagues. And thank you again for your participation this afternoon, and enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anna, on behalf of the team. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leanne. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, everyone.